Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Retro Game Gauntlet Reviewcast. I'm your host, Torsvik, and this week I played 8 Eyes for the NES. 8 Eyes, released in 1988 by a company called Thinking Rabbit, is an action game in the style of Castlevania, along with some explorational and bird elements. Before I go on a quick description of each of the levels, I want to talk about one of the main mechanics, perhaps the most interesting thing, that would otherwise just make this a regular Castlevania clone, is actually the bird partner. In this game, you play as Orin, and you have a bird partner, a falcon, by the name of Kutrus. You send him out as an ally to attack enemies from afar. Certain enemies can only be killed by the bird, and he can also collect items in walls and from a distance. In addition, you can actually have the bird be played by a second player. I'll have a quick overview of the game stage by stage. When you first boot up the game, you'll be met with 8 locations: Spain, Egypt, Italy, India, Africa, Germany, Arabia, and the House of Ruth. You'll go through each of these levels, ending with a boss, and after defeating the boss, you'll be given a colored sword. The color of the sword indicates which boss you should then go to. Reading the manual for this game is somewhat necessary. Similar to Mega Man, you do have the option of actually choosing a route. However, going outside of the intended path is unoptimal and, from what I can tell, would have no real benefits. The first stage is Spain. The level itself primarily is a tower that goes up, and then you'll descend back down it on the opposite side. The boss is very simple. It's a man who will just fence with you. Starting out, you'll probably be able to just bully right into him, attacking him with your sword, and minimal strategy required. The second stage is Egypt, where you sort of do the same. You ascend, descend, but into an underground, then going sideways and back up into a sort of raised temple area. The boss of this is a sort of Moses-looking fellow who attacks with projectiles and leaps abound. Strategy is a bit more required for this boss, generally sticking to the staircase and avoiding him when he leaps and moving up when he uses projectiles is the best method. Next, you'll make your way to Italy, which at the end features a 2-part boss. The boss both brings a large cat with him, and the boss himself will throw playing cards at you. Fourth on the list is India, which features a boss who teleports back and forth across the stage, not unlike Dracula, and launches projectiles at you that you need to lead in order to land hits on him. Fifth is Africa, which is the first of the stages to feature a sort of maze puzzle, very similar to the maze in the Lost Woods. You'll have to go through a descending staircase and descend between a staircase and a pit in a specific order in order to end the loop. The boss of Africa is a large man who will throw axes from afar and also swing his axe at you at close range. Next on the list is Germany, which also has a slight maze-like element to it, not quite as complex in the same way that the Africa stage was, but instead is just sort of maze-like and esoteric in the way that it's arranged. The boss of Germany comically throws what appear to be bladed swastikas at you, and he backpedals as you approach him. The final of the normal levels is Arabia. What's most notable about Arabia itself is that the level probably is the most difficult of the levels. When you first start up the game, you probably won't have the skills or timing to take this level on, which is a little bit obnoxious because if you don't realize that there is a specific order that you're supposed to be doing these levels in, it is the level that it drops your cursor off on when you start the game. The boss of Arabia is probably the boss that most utilizes the falcon. You'll spend a decent amount of time trying to get the falcon in onto the boss before you dive in yourself to deal the final blows. After defeating those 7 levels, you are then able to access the House of Ruth. The House of Ruth is not a full level, it is a boss rush and not even of the full repertoire of bosses, but a boss rush nonetheless with a then final boss, a woman with a whip. As you explore those first 7 levels, you were expected to find, hidden in the walls, various scrolls. Each of these scrolls give a clue as to a final puzzle after you have defeated the final boss. If you have collected all the scrolls, solve the puzzle, you then get the final end scene. Overall, this game was a real pleasure to play, especially after opening up with Chiller in the previous episode. I was consistently engaged throughout the entire time and interested in progressing. I did get frustrated at times, but mostly due to the nature of the Gauntlet itself. Redoing stages over and over, a lot of times there's a real temptation when you're put to a time limit like this to rush your way through the levels, and that's not always an option without cheating or save states. So when I in my first attempts got sort of stuck because I managed to accidentally do the bosses in the wrong order, which I will talk about the colors of the swords in a moment, I did kind of end up writing myself into a corner where I had to reset, and this happened 2 or 3 times, and due to minor errors across it. Let's get a little bit more detail-oriented, though. So, this is an action game, and in an action game, one of the primary focuses is going to be on the combat. You should have strong control over the combat, and an ability to beat probably most every fight with taking either no or minimal damage. The best example of this, of course, would be Castlevania. In Castlevania, many of the enemies are about timing, the way certain enemies will swoop down, or trying to lock bosses in certain positions. There's a specific strategic element to how you jump, how you swing, when you swing, the timing. Sometimes mashing isn't even appropriate. Sometimes it's about rhythm. I think one of the standout features actually about Mega Man is that it's a run and gun as it opens, but the boss fights are actually more of action games, where timing and manipulation of the bosses is key to winning. Counter that to the bosses that you find in Metroid, where you primarily want to just have a high item yield and then tank them with various methods of how you best tank that boss. I can say that this game hits those points dead on. Most of the enemies you can lead into attacks and then attack them as they open up, moving back and forth. And every boss, for the most part, a few of the bosses you can just run in and tank, usually getting a power-up in the level or really abusing certain items. You can kind of just run in and overpower certain bosses. But most of the bosses require that you lead them out, hit them a certain number of times with your bird, or avoid their shots in such a way that you can then hit them on your own. Now, that alone would give this game a solid 3 out of 5, and maybe even a 4, but there are things that bring this game above and beyond the call. First, the smaller one will be that it has puzzle and explorational elements. Although this, on the surface, looks basically just like a Castlevania clone, it allows you to choose each level freely, and you can kind of explore them. There's a goal of looking for specifically urns that increase your maximum HP to bring additional health and item use into the final boss. Add to that, in every level there's also a max health item that will fill your health to full, which the sort of intended goal is to find all the urns, then the max health item so that you can go in with the most health possible. In most of the levels, the max health item is actually before the first or even second urns. So there is a intended element of going forward, collecting items, backtracking to collect another item, moving back forward. This employs a strategy of risk and reward. Risk and reward being one of the most important elements in a sort of game theory. For risking a certain amount of maybe additional damage, you can be rewarded with additional health. Generally being rewarded for having high skill and being able to go the extra mile. Now, the element that really pushes this game, because as far as I can tell is completely unique, is the bird mechanic. When I first started playing, my initial thought was that the bird was going to be kind of a forced element, required to hit switches. There are certain enemies that can only be killed by the bird. However, you do find that the bird is oftentimes viable to get through specific areas by taking minimal damage. Many of the boss fights also may not necessarily require the bird, but using the bird is very beneficial. Add to that, the fact that you could have an additional player use the bird means that we now have a sort of Castlevania-style game with explorational elements that you can also have a second player aid you in making the game easier. You know, I've gone back through Thinking Rabbit's previous games, and nothing comes close to this game as far as I can tell. It's a real shot from the dark. It's actually surprising to me that they haven't done more titles that I recognize, because this game really does stand out as a quality game. Now, that's not to say that's not without negatives. It does kind of have too many controls. It does up A and up B, which, so up, I'm trying to remember, up B, if I'm remembering correctly, in Castlevania's 1 and 3, maybe 2 as well, it's been a while, and 2 is kind of different, is the method that you use to use items. Now, that already feels cumbersome with the addition of staircases, where pushing up is a normal movement, and sometimes it doesn't register quite right when you try to use an item on the stairs. Add to that, though, that not only is the attack button attached to the up, but also the jump button. So, specifically, use item is attached to jumping. So it's very common to accidentally use one of your items while trying to jump and just pushing kind of up and to the side to navigate. The other button, the attack, is attached to releasing the bird. And then down an A causes the bird to do a diving attack. All these controls really do feel cramped on the NES controller. If this was on a Super Nintendo, probably would have no problem whatsoever. But, I mean, even Castlevania can sometimes feel a little bit cramped on the NES controller. It's much more comfortable on the Super Nintendo controller. This game, with even more controls and somewhat dynamic control over some of it as well, can get a little fiddlesome. Another problem, which is kind of irritating, I'm not an expert in NES palettes, but I do feel that a better solution probably could have been found. There's a little bit of problem with color. The difference between yellow and orange isn't really much of a problem, but it's almost completely indistinguishable between blue and purple. This has two problems. One, the boss of Africa gives you a purple sword. Now, when I initially did this and I got a purple sword, it looks blue. And I thought, well, I've done the bosses in the wrong order because blue is for the final level, so apparently you have to do Africa last. I expected the purple sword to stand out a little bit more as purple, but because of this, it did cause some unnecessary restarts. At the end of the game, when you're placing in the gems, the purple and the blue gem look borderline identical. Luckily, you're not penalized for putting the gems in the wrong order. A fairly minor problem, and I think that at least with the gem situation, they do offset it by giving you multiple attempts. I didn't find a lot of use for most of the use items. The use items that you'll find will be a boomerang, a power ball and ice ball, a dagger, a Molotov cocktail, and a gun. I didn't find use for most of these items. The boomerang, initially, I did find the most use for. It's pretty effective at taking out a large number of enemies, especially ones that are difficult to lead out. The Powerball I only ever use in a very specific scenario, the same way you might in Castlevania with axes. The Ice Ball was overwhelmingly useful. All bosses can be frozen by it, and you can get 3 to 4 hits depending on how close you were to them when you hit them with it. I did find that the primary strategy was to not use any items, and instead save up item use for the Ice Ball against the boss. The dagger probably would have seen more use. It is cheaper than the boomerang, however, it only damages some of the enemies in the game. The Molotov cocktail, I never even got to actually deal damage to any of the enemies. And the gun, you only find in a couple situations, and generally the boomerang is more useful. The gun really felt like a slightly improved dagger. Although not a massive negative, if you do have items sitting in your game that have no real functionality, either you should remake some parts of the game to give them functionality and purpose, or you should potentially just get rid of them. This isn't really a situation like Castlevania where items do block other items. You collect them all within the level. So you could even argue actually in Castlevania that the reason that the dagger exists is as a penalty to take away some of your better items. I haven't watched any speedruns or long plays of this game. It's quite possible that one of these weapons are very useful against maybe one of the bosses and I just never realized it. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but at least from a layman position of playing it, many of the items did not feel like they had any use. My final complaint is that the final boss was probably easier than she should have been. I can actually say from the position of playing in the Gauntlet, I was a little bit relieved that the final boss was as easy as she was. I beat her the first time. In fact, I think with good timing, you could probably defeat the final boss with never actually fighting her yourself. You can just have the bird dive in. Though I can say that a boss rush followed by an easier boss is a little bit anticlimactic. My final call for this game, though, is I'm going to have to give it a rating of a 5 on 5. It easily gets the position of 3 for doing kind of the Castlevania formula and doing a solid job of it. It gets bumped up to a 4 for its explorative elements and its excellent execution, and the unique idea of the bird is really the thing that pushes it over into the 5. This game is pretty standout, and I would suggest that if you're listening to this, go out and play this game. Drop what you're doing and check this game out. It's pretty neat. It's really stiff. If you play Castlevania before, you know that you're going to walk in. And it's got a learning curve to get a handle on that controller. But playing through the entire game is very worth it, and it's a very interesting game. It's something that would really benefit from getting an HD modern remake. Or even just another game in a similar vein. So I'll close it out there. Go ahead and like, follow, comment, and subscribe. I put up polls for what game I'm playing every weekend. Go out there and vote on them. Additional footage provided by Mr. Smiley. You can find him on Twitch in the links below. Intro and outro is by Phoenix number 2772.